Hey there, yoga lovers. Welcome to Talk Yoga to Me. We're thrilled to have you with us today as we dive into all things yoga. Whether you're on the mat, in your car, or just relaxing at home, we're here to chat about poses, philosophy, teaching tips, and so much more. So go ahead, roll out your mat. Let's take a deep breath together and let's get started. Talk yoga to me.
Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, Allison.
How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great. Round three. Here we go.
Round three, here we go. So today, let's talk sequencing.
Let's do it.
Yeah? So sequencing is the heart of every yoga class, creating a journey that takes students from start to finish. It's really about more than just stringing a couple poses together. It's about crafting a flow that feels intentional, accessible, and transformative. So, in today's episode, we're diving into the art of sequencing a yoga class and how to create a strong foundation for your students. So, let's explore our experiences a little bit with sequencing. What are our favorite sequences? As teachers, how do we start? What inspires us when planning a class? Let's start with you, Jimmy. Do you pre plan your class sequences when you are teaching?
Oh boy. It's like the boss is asking me to do my homework.
Oh my god.
Or the teacher is asking me to do it. No. I'm still very much a new teacher, so just over 100 classes in. And in the beginning, I did. I step by step, even sometimes like the words I wanted to say because it was still so new.
Yeah.
That I wanted to have the confidence that I knew where I was going. And the students would be able to hopefully have a better experience from that. But now that I'm getting a little bit more experience, I don't find myself writing as much, especially. And whenever I don't have the time, sometimes I don't full out write out a plan. But I often always take, even if it's like the 10 minutes before students walk in, I sit down with myself, think about, what I want to focus on, what area of the body, is there a theme I want to inspire through this class. So it's kind of a mix of things. But I definitely think in the beginning it's helpful to have a plan, even if you deviate from it.
When you plan your sequences, do you remember them all the way through?
No, Lord, no, no. So definitely always forget.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fine. The plan is to always deviate from the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of like being a yoga teacher and having the knowledge that you have. That's why we go through trainings, right? Like we can all make a perfect plan, but we also have the tools in our toolbox that we need when we can't remember exactly what we wrote down before class, whether it was hours before, days before, minutes before, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for like a new teacher, if you're trying to give them some advice on to start out, how do you begin the sequencing process?
I think it's just like what you said, where I'm usually trying to pick something to focus on. I teach a couple different classes, so I've seen it fluctuate for me based on what I'm teaching. I teach Rocket, which is a semi set series. I don't really have to plan too much for that, but I really do enjoy the fact that there is some space for wiggle room there, so it doesn't have to be the exact same thing week after week. My vinyasa classes, I tend to plan more in depth because they're faster. We're moving quickly through things. I want to make sure what I'm saying flows, and we do have that kind of like transformative experience. And then I also used to teach a lot of yin classes, which I didn't know how much I loved yin until I started teaching it. But we'll get more into that later.
Yeah.
When I begin the sequencing process, usually I'm focusing on what I want to do. And when I think about kind of what I want to do as a yoga teacher, I'm thinking a lot about balancing our daily lives. So that's usually where my themes come from. I'm not lost my train of thought there for a second, but basically, I'm thinking about unwinding from the day. And when I say unwinding from the day, I'm thinking about the fact that we're always forward. Right?
Mm.
We're always forward. We are driving, forward. We're on our phones forward. We're reading forward. We're always moving forward. So when I think about sequencing, I'm like, if we're already doing that every single day, how do we balance some of that out? Well, I guess we're going to take everything back,
Yeah,
right?
that makes sense.
And that's usually where I start. So I start with this overarching kind of physical idea because we're teaching asana classes. And then from there, kind of sprinkle in what does it really mean to take it back? What does it mean to find balance? How can I sprinkle little philosophical ideas in there? Energy is a really big important one for me too because I'm usually teaching in the evening after I've already had a full day, as do many of the students that come to class, right? They've had a full day, they're ending their day with yoga, so we need to start with that. It's almost like a decompression at the beginning of class to move into a flow to then settle down to kind of end your evening there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you have a really great tool, or I guess maybe worksheet, that I've seen you give to like other YTT students. Can you talk about that you have and like how that helps you?
Yeah, I guess without showing it, it's hard to kind of say exactly what it is, right? But basically, I pick like a focus. What am I focusing on today? Usually, it's that undoing. We're doing full body flows typically. And I'll start to kind of break things down into like little segments or little threads, if you will. So I'll put together, I usually have 4, and I teach vinyasa, so they're usually strung together in a sun salutation style. And when I do this, I pick kind of like a peak pose or a peak sequence. So sometimes we're not working up to a singular pose, but we're working up to like the most complex thread, if you will. I like to start things low to the ground. We'll do a thread of kind of keeping things more points of contact with the earth, lower center of gravity. Then you work up from there, and then you get challenged from there, and then you kind of counter it and bring it back down, right?
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, that was a tool that I recently created in like a document format when I was looking through all of the flows, because I do pre-plan all of my class sequences. And I say that like with a little asterisk caveat here, because I pre-plan a lot of my class sequences, but I also go back and recycle old ones, right? So I have a whole book of sequences that I've used, and sometimes I read back through them and I'm like, ugh, what was I thinking with that one? That doesn't make any sense. So it's a learning experience, you know what I mean? And I realized I've used this format for sequencing my vinyasa classes for almost as long as I've been a teacher, and it's always worked really well for me because the same way I don't necessarily bring my notes to class with me. I used to. I also used to keep it on my phone. But even if I sat down for 10 minutes before class, I would write out my sequence using my format, and then I would kind of crinkle it up, throw it away, and be like, okay, I'm ready now. Whether I remembered it all or not is a different story.
Sure.
But yeah, that's kind of how I work through my sequencing process. What factors influence your classes and your class sequences?
Yeah. And this is kind of probably, I don't know if this is the best way to go about things or not, but I really reflect on how my body's feeling, because some days it's my shoulders hurt, or it's my hips or whatever, and that, because it's always changing, our pain points, that kind of guides me a little bit sometimes of like, okay, what, before class when I'm trying to plan, what can I do to relieve this tension in like my rhomboids or whatever area of my body that's hurting, and then I can slowly build, and that's not always, but sometimes I can slowly build a sequence from there.
Yeah.
And it's usually focused around a part of the body, and it always winds up being like a full body flow, to some extent, but
rightfully so, right? Like, it's all connected.
For me, it's like, am I focusing on twists or hips? Like, I feel like those are the bigger,
two
big
absolutely.
areas.
Also, I like to always relate back to it. I would never say that's not a great way to do it, because I'm like, man, if you feel that way, somebody else feels that way too, right? And they could use that same relief. if you
Yeah.
will. Right.
And I teach, yeah, definitely. People could use the same relief, and maybe they're feeling a different way that week, but I get it right the next week. My
Yeah.
hips are hurting and their hips are hurting, you know? And I teach them slow flows. With those, I it usually is a lot of hips, but for me, the sequencing is about keeping things as close together as possible. So I
What
don't
do you
want
mean
to,
by that?
like, if we're close to the ground, I want to stay close to the ground as long as
Mm-hmm.
I can and sequence those things together so we're not doing a lot of like up and down movement.
Yeah.
I want to stay grounded for as long as possible, and then whenever we get up, I want to, do all the up things at once.
Do all the up things, yeah.
Which is kind of similar in a vinyasa where you're saying like you start out lower to the ground to warm up, and then you eventually get,
Mm-hmm.
up into your standing or balancing poses. Two, also, if you're using props, like that's an important factor to think about, is you don't want people to be pulling the bolster out and then putting it away back and forth a bunch of times. If it's a more common class, try and string those things together so that you can utilize the bolster for as long as you need and then be done with it.
Yeah, that's definitely a way that feels organized, creative, and intentional, right? Having that thought process. And I think it's really important. Not that you have to do it every single time, but I think it's an important tool, whether you're starting out as a teacher or even if you're a seasoned teacher, kind of keeping those ideas together, right? So, like you said, you're not like, oh, lay your bolster out, we're gonna do this, now put it away, we're gonna flow, now bring that bolster back out, which you can make it work, right? But you would go in there with a plan to make that work.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of a plan, how do you balance the structure between planning and spontaneity in your class?
So the spontaneity comes accidentally, if you will.
Yeah, for sure.
I absolutely am a planner. I plan I plan everything. I plan my week, I plan my month, I plan my day. Do any of those things ever happen in accordance with my plan? No. No, never. Almost never. So I'm also like very fluid in my personal life and in my teaching. So I always make a sequence. I always know what I want to work on. And just a little tidbit about me is I used to focus on body parts. So I would be like, hey guys, we are going to do a 60-minute vinyasa. Today we are going to work core focus class. And you know what we wouldn't do? Core. We would completely leave out of the entire class? Core. Be like, hey y'all, we're gonna focus a lot on hips today. Get those junk drawers cleaned out. You know what we would do? A million chaturangas. No hips. No hips.
All shoulders.
Yeah, so I stopped being specific about my classes. So I'm always like full body flow. Unwinding the week means something different today than it did yesterday, and we might balance. And whether that balance means standing on one foot or balancing left and right or balancing front and back, we don't know yet. We'll find out.
Mm-hmm.
So I always make a plan. I have my little sequences. And then sometimes I start teaching class and they just, I'm human. They go out the window. I don't remember what I wrote. I don't remember where I was going with something, or I just forget what comes next. So I just make it up as I go. And I say I make it up as I go, but with the teaching toolbox that we have, right? So we're still doing it from an educated place. We're still doing it from a place that makes sense. But I do, like, my spontaneity is very accidental. I don't function well when I come to class without a plan. So, yeah, but then those usually end up being like the most fun classes. And I'm like, oh, I just thought of a new thread that I want to use going forward. Or quite the opposite. I'm like, let's never do that one again,
And that's like the cusp of trying to discover something new. Some things are going to work, some things aren't. But you kind of got to be thrust into it to invent. Not really invent, but create something new to you.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Your students.
I think some of that comes with like personal practice too, right?
Yeah.
Because also, like, we don't want to make every mistake possible from the seat of the teacher. Sometimes it's nice to practice the things that we want to teach, and we'll be like, oh, that didn't make sense, not even for me.
Yeah.
And quite the opposite. Sometimes things make sense for us, and we're like, oh, that's because I've been doing yoga for 10 years. That's maybe not something we should put in a regular class that everybody can do. You know what I mean?
Sure. Save that for like the night when it's your 5 to 10 star students who've been coming for a decade or whatever.
Star students.
Or not star students. YTT throwback.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes, gold star. So with sequencing, because it is a thing we all do. What challenges have you faced with when you do create your own sequence? And we'll start there.
Yeah. I think the challenges are at the transitions, I think that's, at least for me as a new teacher, that's often what I struggle with. I often know where I want to go, but that is sequencing, right? Is the transitions.
How
It's
do we
like
get there?
stringing it all together, exactly. But trying to find that balance between I want this to be challenging and I want it to be accessible, and figuring out what poses are going to be stringed in next. And I think too, another challenge with sequencing is the different levels that you may have in your class. So trying to offer variations whenever we are getting into like the peaker sequences or poses.
Yeah.
And kind of, I like building it to where if we're, for instance, we're like trying to come into a full bind eventually in our extended side angle, each flow building up to that, you're getting deeper into it so that people know, and you tell them, hey, you try it out, you don't love it, like go back to the step before. But that can be challenging to get your mind right, if you will, when you're trying to sequence a class together.
Yeah, especially if, well, a lot of different things. If you're a new teacher, that can be really challenging because we just have different tools ready to go. But also, sometimes, like, the things you say and the things you sequence just don't make sense to whoever you're teaching to, right? So sometimes it's not even what you've put together, if you will.
Yeah,
right?
The communication part of it.
Yeah, the communication part of it, for sure. Have you ever had a sequence that just didn't land with students before? Like where you're just really struggle busing it, and how did you adapt afterwards?
It was in my slow flow class, and I'm, trying to do something different with our reclined figure 4, where we're keeping like the grounded leg static and we're just hinging the lifted knee in towards the chest, and everyone's lifting their foot off the ground because that's like what they're used to. And I think stringing along the sequence I learned later was to go with what's natural to them, start with them pulling it in towards their chest, and then ground the foot, tell them to leave the foot there and just hinge the hip. So you're kind of doing what they are used to first, and then they're more tuned into how you're gonna change it after.
Yeah, that's so smart, and I like that you like put those two things together to make that work.
Yeah, I mean, I still forget sometimes, and I start off, I'm like, no one's doing it. Oh, yep, messed that one up again. It happens. Yeah. Can you share one of your favorite class sequences and what made it work?
Oh no. I'm like, should I do it? Should I stand up and no, I'm just kidding.
I think we got the room. We got the socks on, make it real challenging.
Absolutely not. Goodness. That's a tough one. I don't know that I have a favorite class sequence. Some of the things I really love to do, like I love my creative sequencing for sure, but sometimes I really like to go into like those like rocket yoga roots and create like sequences from there, especially because I have a lot of people who tend to come to rocket and my vinyasa classes, so it's fun to take that rocket and turn it kind of vinyasa-y and make it really familiar for those students, and you have the opportunity to add a little bit more to it and make it a little bit more flowy. um, and that's kind of really where I go to when I think of like all my favorite things to teach. But man, I don't have a singular example of a sequence.
I've got one of yours that I really like.
Okay.
You do a ladder sequence where we're doing a series of we're starting out low with like half splits, and then eventually it progresses into like airplane arms half splits, but then you're getting into the high lunge and we're folding over a straight leg, and you just build and build on that. So I mean, I think a lot of people probably enjoy a ladder sequence.
Yeah.
And you do a lot of different ones that aren't even ladder sequences with those poses. But yeah, I enjoy that progression and the predictability of it as a student.
So nice to hear. I forgot about those. I've been doing a lot of ladder sequences lately, and I think that's definitely, there are benefits to it, right? Like you talked about, where it's predictable, it builds, it is like something where you know what's coming next, but then you're like, where are we going with this? And then all of it, everything starts to make sense, right? But as a teacher, those are the ones I pull out of my toolbox when I'm having a hard brain day. Like, I'm not able to think things like from front, like, if I were to write a sequence down, it would immediately be out the window. I love ladder flows for that reason. And they get such good feedback from students because they're like, oh, I got to go into this almost like flow stakes. I knew where we were going and what we were doing, and all of a sudden this thing I didn't think I could do, I did. And I'm like, it makes you feel kind of good. You're like, no, that was nice.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and the benefit too as a teacher to where you can kind of it eats up time, if you will, but I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, just like you're saying, it becomes a flow state for the students, but you have your one sequence basically, and you're just putting those building blocks on one at a time. Yeah. And so you have a lot less to plan and not as much mental power maybe.
Absolutely.
To keep the class going.
I love being a student in a ladder class too, because I'm the same way. I'm a planner, so I like to know what's coming next. I like to know where I'm going. Not to say that I don't love a creative sequence as well, but I like those, especially if you're doing it in a vinyasa style where you're moving a little bit faster. The ladder just really helps to kind of cultivate that flow of energy throughout the entire class, because you know where you're going. You don't have to use as many cues. You don't have to talk as much. And your students can follow along with you sometimes.
Yeah. And I like too that you can kind of, I teach mostly hatha vinyasa, so you can kind of hold in to when you're building on to the next step of the ladder or the next rung of the ladder, you can cue a little bit deeper on that of like, okay, we want our hips to be parallel to the front edge of the mat, so reach that left hip forward, right hip back. And then they know that, so you don't have to cue it the next time. But also they're getting that holding time into some of these asanas to make it a hatha vinyasa style ladder.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. Because then it gives you the chance to inform and like educate, but also flow. Yeah. I think that's awesome. So how did sequencing advance for you from the time you finished YTT to kind of like where you are and how you sequence your classes now?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. I have more confidence in trying something new, but then also I have for my spontaneity, it has to be more planned, I feel like, which is probably makes it not spontaneous at all. But what I mean is, whenever I find myself not sure of where I was going to go next
Mm-hmm.
and I deviate from the plan, I usually go to something I just typically do.
Yeah.
Because I don't have the confidence yet, quite to be able to really explore on the fly with something new with students
Well,
there.
I wouldn't say that you don't have the confidence. I mean, you're like, we're all doing that, just doing it with different sequences that we've practiced before. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm the same way. I'm not going to try something super brand new and challenging per se that I've never done before, because I have been like, oh yeah, guys, just do this. It makes total sense in my head, and I watch everybody look around and they're like, what did she just tell us to do with our foot? Like, so yeah, I think it's also
Put your
just
hip under your foot.
yeah, something silly like that. And I'm like, I don't know, it made sense when I asked you to do it, but obviously I didn't think that part all the way through. But yeah, I think it's just like building those things that you know to fall back on. Like, you're like, oh, I have these feet. Like, I have my feet set up in this way, so I'm going to add these several things that I know I like to do here, right?
Something I like to play around with is the transitioning from the top of the mat to like a warrior two kind of style stance, or high lunge or high crescent lunge. Is instead of always working through the chaturanga, like coming from a like a warrior three and then stepping back, or
so like standing to balance to step back versus like a vinyasa floated down dog to step forward. Yeah.
Especially because then I've been trying to get more balancing closer towards the beginning, not the beginning of class, but like the middle of class rather than the end, because I feel like people's feet aren't quite worn out yet. And it gives them the chance to have a little bit more confidence in the balance poses, which are really hard. But it changes up the transition, gives, the shoulders and chaturanga arms a little bit of a break.
It does, and it's also so much more accessible from like an open class standpoint to step back than it is to step forward. So you can make that available for all levels, which is really, really nice, because stepping forward from downward facing dog is hard.
Yeah.
If you're used to doing it and you're like, oh, I know how to move my body, but there are a lot of opportunities to struggle with just that simple transition. You know what I mean?
Like from like a crescent, high crescent into a warrior three and then stepping forward? Or just stepping forward?
From like a down dog, bringing your foot in between your hands to that. So,
making that space between your heart and the ground is
hard. And having that like lift and the hip flexor strength and the core strength, and then can your leg even fit in between your chest and the floor? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool that you do that, because it just shows that there's accessibility in your class, and balancing is hard, so it doesn't make it any easier. It just makes it accessible and easier, not interchangeable.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely.
Yeah. All right, Jimmy, what advice would you give new teachers who are just starting out?
Even if the plan changes, plan. Anticipate.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Like, be willing to change, but get your mind right about it. Write it out, practice it, even practice speaking, using your cueing, using your yoga voice. Record yourself as you're doing it. And even sometimes, like, you could record yourself cueing and sequencing the class, and then listen to yourself and try and do it.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And if you're confused,
there you go. And
your students will probably be confused.
You don't have to plan out every single class word for word, detail for detail. Also, just having those, like a list of poses in order, right? You want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 poses, and then you want to switch sides, right? Because sequencing isn't writing out everything word for word for word for word. Having that can be where the spontaneity comes in. But come to class with a plan, because you're the teacher. You're teaching students who are here to learn from you and take a yoga class. Come to class with a plan. It doesn't have to be a brand new plan every single time. You can recycle plans, and that works just fine. And those will begin to evolve, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And sequencing is such a foundational part of being a yoga teacher. But it's also a creative process and it's going to evolve over time. So the more you experiment, the more you're going to find your unique voice as a teacher. So thank y'all for hanging out with us today and learning a little bit about sequencing. Remember, it's all about creating a flow that feels good for both you and your students. So don't be afraid to play around with the different combinations and find what clicks. Keep it fun, flexible, and of course, enjoy the process.
Until next time, take care of yourselves and talk yoga to me again soon.